look at the systems your organization runs today, almost everything is leaving a trail. Feature flags, experiments, observability traces, internal dashboards, customer support tickets, even the way teams use artificial intelligence assistants at work, all of it produces data that used to be dismissed as exhaust. In reality, that exhaust is detailed evidence of who did what, when, where, and with which systems. In this Wednesday headline feature from Bare Metal Cyber magazine, developed by Bare Metal Cyber, we are going to treat that reality seriously and explore what it means to design as if almost everything your stack touches is effectively sensitive. The central idea is simple but uncomfortable. Instead of trying to perfectly separate the sensitive things from the non-sensitive things, we flip the default. We act as if every interaction could matter, and every field could hurt us if it is mishandled. Then we force that assumption into our architecture, our platform choices, and our leadership decisions. Rather than relying on employees to correctly pick a sensitivity label from a drop-down menu, we ask the system to behave as if sensitivity is the norm, and exceptions are rare, justified, and recorded. To get there, we first need to understand how ordinary data turns into dynamite. If you zoom out on a typical modern environment, almost nothing is left unmeasured. Product teams track clicks, scrolls, and funnels. Growth teams track referrals and campaigns. Reliability teams collect dense telemetry from every microservice and dependency. Security teams track authentication events and policy decisions. On their own, none of these items looks like a password, a credit card, or a trade secret. But when you combine them, they reveal a detailed picture of users, systems, and business behavior. The sensitivity lives in combinations and context. A time series of application calls from a certain region can reveal a major customer's adoption curve and revenue trend. Error logs that capture internal identifiers and partner names can expose your dependency chain and parts of your network layout. Support records that show which segments struggle with specific features can tell a competitor or an adversary where you are weak and where you are investing. None of those fields needed to be labeled confidential to cause damage. The more correlated and long-lived the data is, the easier it becomes to reconstruct something you care about. Once you accept that, the question is no longer, is this specific field sensitive in isolation, but how dangerous does this become when combined with everything else we know and everything else we log? Sensitivity stops being a static category and starts looking like potential energy that grows with history, density, and reuse. For leaders, this is a shift in mental model. It forces you to treat telemetry, analytics, and operational data as first-class assets that will be examined by regulators, litigators, and attackers, not as byproducts that sit outside your risk story. Most organizations respond to data risk by building a classification framework. Somewhere there is a document or slide that defines tiers like public, internal, confidential, and restricted, with examples and color codes. Policies describe how each tier must be handled, and tools may even stamp those labels across documents and dashboards. On paper, this looks disciplined. In practice, it often becomes a comforting mirage. Data moves, transforms, and recombines too fast for human-driven classification to keep up, especially at the edges, where people are experimenting, integrating new services, or solving urgent problems. Classification schemes tend to focus on the obvious items: regulated personal data, payment information, formal intellectual property. They spend less time on derivative data and context, the logs, feature stores, machine learning training sets, and analytics extracts that live inside monitoring stacks and data platforms. Many breach statements downplay impact by saying that only telemetry or only metadata was accessed, as if that is inherently benign. In reality, those categories can reveal the structure of your defenses, usage patterns for high-value accounts, and details of your internal segmentation that make later attacks cheaper and more effective. There is also the question of how classification is applied.
Asking employees to assign labels manually sounds empowering, but most people are busy and do not have a global view of how their data will be used, enriched, and combined. Automation helps for specific patterns, like finding payment card numbers or social security numbers in text. Lineage tools help when all data passes through approved platforms. Yet those controls rarely cover the long tail of cloud services, side databases, and ad hoc scripts that grow up around the edges of your official systems. The result is that you have classification, but the real control surface is defined by where data actually flows and how your defaults behave in those places.
Sensitive by default does not discard classification, it changes the role. Instead of being the primary safety mechanism, labels become hints that you use to tighten or relax controls that already assume risk. You start with broad protections and narrow access. You encrypt by default, restrict access by default, log carefully by default. Then you use classification, lineage, and usage patterns as evidence when someone wants to treat a dataset as less sensitive in a specific context. The burden of proof moves from "why would we treat this as sensitive?" to "what makes us so sure we can safely treat this as ordinary?"
Translating that posture into architecture means accepting a blunt design principle. The system should act as if any given piece of data could matter. Encryption is a starting point, but not the whole story. You want storage services, message queues, and data pipelines that expect protected payloads. That means enforcing strong key management, automatic rotation, and the consistent use of service identities instead of shared secrets. It means defaulting to encrypted channels and hardened configurations, so that building something insecure requires deliberate effort rather than a moment of inattention.
Access control follows the same logic. If you assume that broad, long-lived permissions will eventually be abused or leaked, you design for least privilege and dynamic access from the beginning. Instead of granting permanent administrator rights or all database access, you push teams towards request flows that grant limited permissions for specific tasks and durations. You bias your systems towards time-bound and purpose-bound access with approvals, logs, and automatic revocation. Developers and operators can still get the access they need, but they do so through mechanisms that leave a clear trail and that are easier to audit and tighten over time.
Data minimization and transformation are the third pillar. Rather than spraying raw, richly identifying data across the environment, you normalize patterns like tokenization of high-risk fields, default pseudonymization, and structured redaction in logs and traces. Observability systems can be configured to drop or mask sensitive attributes before they cross service boundaries, while still preserving enough information for debugging and performance tuning. Analytics platforms can consume pre-aggregated or de-identified datasets by default, with tightly controlled pathways for raw access when there is a compelling, approved reason. These measures do not eliminate risk, but they dramatically reduce the blast radius when, inevitably, something goes wrong.
For these patterns to stick, they cannot remain security recommendations. They need to become part of the platform. That is where the work shifts from policy to product. If teams must piece together encryption, logging hygiene, and access controls on their own from scattered documents and tool settings, many will take shortcuts. If instead, your shared services, libraries, and templates already encode sensitive by default behavior, then the easiest way to build is also the safest. When a new service template comes with hardened defaults, opinionated configuration, and well-integrated identity and authorization from the first commit, you are no longer asking teams to choose between safety and speed.
This is where platform engineering becomes central. A strong internal platform does not just abstract away infrastructure. It offers a golden path, a supported way of building services, workflows, and data flows that embeds your best practices. In a sensitive by default world, the golden path carries your security posture as part of its design. It chooses which data stores are available and how they are configured. It standardizes how services log and how those logs are scrubbed. It defines the sanctioned patterns for secrets management and configuration.
It gives teams a clear, well-supported route that minimizes cognitive load and negotiation.
If you treat the golden path as a real product, you invest in the experience. You assign product management, conduct user research, and measure adoption. You set expectations for support and responsiveness. You make sure that edge cases can be addressed without forcing teams to abandon the path entirely. When this is done well, security controls fade into the background. Developers talk about how easy it is to build on the platform, and security leaders see that new services and data flows are automatically inheriting the right posture. Friction still exists, but it is intentional and concentrated where the risk justifies it.
Of course, tightening defaults and guiding everyone onto a golden path does generate criticism. Product leaders will worry about time to market. Teams that built their own tools will resist giving them up. Operations staff may fear losing flexibility during incidents. If sensitive by default is seen as a pure security project, those concerns will dominate. That is why leadership framing matters. You need to present this posture as a way to protect customers, protect innovation, and meet regulatory expectations in a world where ordinary data can cause extraordinary harm, not as a compliance exercise for audits.
Making that case starts with visibility. You bring the concept to your executive peers and your board as a deliberate shift in how you design and operate systems. You explain that you are no longer comfortable pretending that only a small set of clearly labeled data deserves strong controls. You highlight how correlation power, analytics, and modern threats have changed the situation. Then you outline the concrete areas where you plan to move first: observability, analytics platforms, integration hubs, and the core identity and access stack that governs who can see and change what.
You cannot transform everything at once, so sequencing is key. You focus on the platforms and data flows where the combination of context, volume, and reuse makes the potential damage highest. For each, you define what sensitive by default means in practice. You might require encryption and strong key management with no exceptions. You might demand that all access is logged and time-bound. You might insist that logs are scrubbed before leaving service boundaries and that external integrations consume only the minimum data needed. You tie funding and timelines to these outcomes, and you measure progress in terms that matter to you, such as the percentage of core services running on the golden path, or the fraction of high-risk data flows that are now covered by strong defaults. Even with strong defaults, there will be legitimate reasons to relax controls. Data scientists will need access to richer data for modeling. Product teams will want to run experiments that require more detail. Partners may need more visibility for joint operations or support. In a sensitive by default culture, those relaxations do not happen quietly. They are treated as explicit risk decisions. You require a clear purpose, defined scope, and time limits. You add compensating controls where necessary. You involve legal and privacy functions for higher risk cases. You make sure there is a trail of who approved what and why, so that you can revisit those choices as your environment and obligations evolve. Handled this way, easing protections becomes as serious a step as launching a new external application. People think carefully about it. They understand that they will need to justify it if something goes wrong. Over time, this reduces casual exceptions and builds a shared sense that everything matters is not a slogan, but a real operating principle. Teams learn that if they want more flexibility, they need to help improve the golden path and underlying platforms, not bypass them.
Underneath all of this, the core mental model is straightforward. You stop pretending that you can correctly and permanently tag every piece of data and rely on those tags as your main line of defense. You recognize that context and correlation have made so-called ordinary data powerful, and you design your systems as if that is true. Sensitive by default means you assume risk first and then dial it down where you have evidence, not the other way around. It means your architecture, your platform, and your leadership practices all push toward the same direction. Protect broadly, relax carefully, and document the boundaries.
When leaders truly internalize this posture,
the conversation changes. Boards and executives start asking where correlation power concentrates in your environment and how your systems behave in those zones by default. Engineering discussions shift from arguing about whether a particular control is too much to asking what would justify weakening it. Metrics move away from counting labels and policies and toward tracking how much of the organization actually runs on safe rails. The organization becomes more cautious about proliferating raw data and more willing to invest in common infrastructure that keeps the damage limited when something inevitably goes wrong.
The practical next step is not another policy document. It is a focused conversation with your platform, data, and product leaders. Ask them one simple question. If we acted as if everything mattered, unless we could prove otherwise, which system would we redesign first? And what would we stop tolerating in how it handles data today? Their answers will tell you where to begin and how serious your current posture really is. From there, sensitive by default stops being an aspiration and starts becoming the way you design, build, and lead.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.